Still, I stood freezing outside my own home on Thanksgiving, the dining room light glowing as my wife and children ate turkey without their husband or father at the table. As I rested my gloved hand against the frozen siding, I kept my breathing steady, realizing no one had noticed I wasn't there. While that same warm light spilled through the window, it burned against the years I'd spent providing while slowly disappearing. The same light followed my thoughts, as I understood this wasn't an accident. It was the result of silence turning into distance. That's when the truth settled cold. I wasn't locked out of my family. I'd been erased inside it. Still, standing in that light, I made a quiet decision not to beg my way back in, but to take my place back the hard way. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Jim stood at the edge of the driveway, his gloved hand resting lightly against the cold siding of the house. Through the living room window, the glow of yellow light spilled into the dusk, soft and inviting. Inside, his family sat crowded around the dining table. He could see the movement of hands, the tilt of heads, the shake of laughter. Someone had just said something funny. He didn't know who. He only knew the sound didn't reach him. The glass kept it sealed away, like warmth behind a locked door. He shifted his weight, the ache in his knees reminding him of his age. 68 years of life, and somehow he was standing outside his own home on Thanksgiving, watching instead of belonging. The turkey sat in the center of the table, steam fogging the window. Marie was there, her hair neatly pinned back, smiling in that careful way she'd learned over the years. Carl leaned back in his chair, confident, comfortable. Lily's hands moved as she talked, animated, alive. And Ethan Jim's chest tightened when he saw him sat close to his own family, laughing easily, like a man who had long ago learned how to live without his father. The cold crept in fast. Jim pulled his coat tighter, the fabric stiff with age, the zipper catching halfway up. A sharp sting settled in his chest, not from the temperature, but from the realization that no one had noticed he wasn't there. No one had come to the door. No one had looked out the window and wondered. Loneliness pressed down on him, heavy and quiet, the kind that didn't announce itself until it was already too late to escape. For a moment, his mind betrayed him, dragging him backward. Other Thanksgivings, other versions of himself. He saw his hands carving the turkey, steady and proud, heard his own voice filling the room, telling stories that made the kids groan and laugh at the same time. He remembered Ethan at 12, hanging on every word. Carl sneaking extra rolls when he thought no one was looking. Lily helping Marie in the kitchen, glancing over her shoulder at Jim like she needed his approval to breathe. Back then, he mattered. Back then, he was the center without trying to be. The memory faded, leaving behind something hollow. Now, the house felt like a place he had once lived, not somewhere he belonged. The distance between him and the people inside wasn't measured in feet, but in years of missed conversations, swallowed apologies, and silence that hardened into habit. He'd thought time would soften things. Instead, it had erased him. Jim turned away from the window. He didn't want to see Ethan laugh anymore. Didn't want to imagine Marie's eyes flicking toward the empty chair, then away. He stepped off the driveway and onto the sidewalk, the concrete biting through the soles of his boots. The air was sharp, each breath visible, floating away from him like something he couldn't hold on to. He walked without direction, past houses glowing with warmth, past cars lining curbs, past families who didn't know his name. His hands trembled, not just from the cold. He told himself he was walking it off, clearing his head, giving them space. The truth was harder. Standing still felt unbearable. Moving, even into the cold, felt like survival. With every step, the contrast sharpened. Warmth behind him, cold ahead, laughter versus silence. He wondered when exactly he'd become the man who watched instead of participated. When pride had replaced presence, when guilt had grown too heavy to carry back inside, he stopped at the corner and looked down the street, the road stretching empty and gray. Going back meant facing the looks, the pauses, the questions no one wanted to ask out loud. It meant sitting at the table as a guest in his own family. Staying out here hurt, but going back felt like admitting something he wasn't sure he could say yet. Jim stood there, breath fogging the air. knowing the door behind him was still open but unsure if he still had the strength to walk back through it. Jim found a bench at the edge of the small neighborhood park, tucked far enough behind a row of bare trees that the Carter house was no longer visible. The wind cut through the branches, sharp and constant, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the muffled echoes of laughter from houses nearby. He lowered himself onto the bench slowly, joints protesting, and rested his hands on his knees, like he needed to remind himself he was still there. Once he stopped moving, the memories came. Ethan's face rose first, not as the man he'd seen through the window, but as he was years ago, angry, jaw tight, eyes burning with something Jim hadn't known how to handle. He remembered the words as clearly as if they were still hanging in the air between them. "You were never there when it mattered." Ethan hadn't shouted. That had been the worst part. His voice had been steady, almost tired, like he'd rehearsed the sentence long before saying it out loud. Jim had tried to explain, tried to apologize, but every sentence had landed wrong. The more he spoke, the further Ethan seemed to pull away, as if each word confirmed something Ethan had already decided about him. Jim hadn't known then that apologies delivered too late can sound like excuses. He only knew that when Ethan finally walked away, something in their relationship cracked and never quite sealed back together. The bench was cold beneath him. Jim shifted, crossing his arms, pressing his hands into his coat sleeves for warmth. He wondered how many times over the years Ethan had replayed those moments, stacking them on top of each other until they formed a wall Jim couldn't climb anymore. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound startled him. For a second, he considered ignoring it, but habit won. He pulled it out and saw Marie's name glowing on the screen. "Jim," she said gently when he answered. He could hear the clink of silverware behind her, the low murmur of voices. "I fixed you a plate. You should come in before it gets colder." He closed his eyes. The smell of turkey and stuffing filled his imagination, warm and familiar, and for a moment his stomach tightened with hunger. But the thought of carrying that plate to the table, of sitting down under everyone's careful glances, felt heavier than the cold. "I'm not hungry," he said quietly. There was a pause. "Please," Marie said, not pushing, just hoping. "Maybe later," Jim replied, though he didn't believe it himself. He ended the call before she could say anything else. As the phone slipped back into his pocket, raised voices drifted through the air. Not shouting, nothing like that, but tension threaded through the words. Lily and Carl. He recognized their tones immediately. Carl's clipped impatience, Lily's strained calm. Even from this distance, Jim could tell it was the kind of argument built from old habits, from things left unsaid for too long. It hit him then, harder than the cold. His absence hadn't created peace. It had created gaps, fractures. Spaces where resentment and misunderstanding had quietly settled in. He had convinced himself that stepping back was easier for everyone. Listening now, he realized it had only shifted the weight onto them. Jim leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. He thought about going back, about standing up, walking down the street, opening the door, and taking his seat. The image rose clearly and collapsed just as fast. Pride wrapped itself around his chest, tight and unyielding. So did fear. What if it was too late? What if his presence only made things worse? He thought of all the moments he'd missed, the conversations he'd avoided because they were uncomfortable, the times he'd chosen silence instead of vulnerability. None of it had seemed catastrophic at the time. Just small decisions, small retreats, but stacked together, they had built the distance he now couldn't cross. The wind picked up, rattling the branches above him. Jim pulled his coat tighter, shoulders hunched, fighting the urge to stand. Inside him, two instincts battled quietly. One told him to get up, to try, to stop wasting what little time he had left. The other whispered that some things, once broken, stay broken, and that walking away might hurt less than failing again. Jim stayed where he was, staring down the empty path ahead, unable to decide whether the harder choice was to go back or to finally let go. Jim stayed on the bench as the light thinned, the sky turning the dull gray of early evening. The cold had settled deep now, no longer sharp but constant, like it intended to stay. He barely noticed it. His mind had already gone somewhere else, back to a time when Ethan's world still revolved around him. He saw his son at 8 years old, standing in the driveway with a glove too big for his hand, waiting patiently while Jim finished tightening the laces on his boots. Ethan had always waited like that, quiet but hopeful, eyes tracking every move Jim made. Jim remembered teaching him how to throw, how Ethan's face lit up the first time the ball landed, exactly where Jim said it would. Back then, admiration had come easily. Jim hadn't needed to say much, just showing up had been enough. Those memories hurt now, because they were so clear. There had been a time when the family felt solid, anchored. Holidays were loud, crowded, full of overlapping conversations and familiar routines. Ethan used to sit close to Jim at the table, leaning in when Jim spoke, like he didn't want to miss anything. Somewhere along the way, that closeness faded not with a single moment, but with years of emotional distance Jim never learned how to bridge. The truth settled in slowly, heavier than any accusation Ethan had ever thrown at him. Jim hadn't known how to say "I love you" without feeling exposed. He hadn't known how to admit fear, or uncertainty, or regret. He'd believed that providing, staying steady, and avoiding conflict was enough. He saw now how wrong he'd been. Love left unspoken had felt like indifference to a son who needed reassurance. Ethan's empty chair at the table that afternoon became a symbol Jim couldn't escape. It wasn't just about one holiday. It was every birthday missed, every call that went unanswered, every invitation quietly declined. His family hadn't vanished overnight. They had learned how to move forward without him. And somehow, that realization hurt more than being openly rejected. Footsteps approached along the path. Jim looked up to see Marie standing a few feet away, her coat pulled tight, her face lined with concern. She didn't sit beside him right away. She stood, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to enter the space he'd carved around himself. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. Jim exhaled through his nose. "Feels like I already did." Marie sat beside him then, close enough that he could feel the warmth from her arm. "Ethan's stubborn," she said carefully. "He always has been. But that doesn't mean it's over. Not unless you decide it is." Jim shook his head. "You didn't hear the last things he said to me." He hadn't told anyone about that conversation. Not fully. He remembered it now, with brutal clarity. Ethan standing in the doorway, voice tight, saying things that cut because they were true. Jim had fired back, defensive, proud, wounded. Words meant to protect himself had landed like final blows. He'd watched Ethan walk away without stopping him. That was the part that haunted him most. "I should have fixed it then," Jim said quietly. "Instead, I let him go." Marie reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "It's not too late." Jim wanted to believe her, but doubt pressed in fast. Years of silence weren't nothing. Pain didn't evaporate just because someone finally felt ready to face it. What if Ethan didn't want a relationship anymore? What if reaching out now only reopened wounds that had finally scarred over? The fear settled deep in his chest, heavy and unmoving. Time wasn't on his side. He felt it in his bones, in the way cold lingered longer than it used to. If he waited much longer, there might not be another chance, no next holiday, no better moment. Marie stood, brushing off her coat. "Come inside when you're ready," she said. "Or don't. But don't tell yourself there's nothing you can do." She walked back toward the house, leaving Jim alone again with the sound of the wind and his own thoughts. He stared down the path, heart pounding, knowing the truth he'd been avoiding had finally caught up with him. If he didn't act soon, the distance between him and his son might become permanent, and that was a loss he wasn't sure he could survive. Jim had barely shifted from the spot near the tree line when he heard footsteps crunching over the frozen grass. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Lily moved with a familiar urgency, the same way she had as a child when she was determined to fix something before it got worse. "Dad," she said, her voice careful, not wanting to startle him. "Dinner's almost done. You should come back inside." Jim looked up at her. She stood with her hands tucked into her sleeves, cheeks red from the cold, eyes searching his face like she was trying to read a language he'd never taught her properly. For a moment, he considered standing, his muscles even tensed, ready to obey. But the weight in his chest pressed him back down. "I don't know if that's a good idea," he said. Lily frowned, stepping closer. "Why wouldn't it be?" He didn't have an answer that felt honest without being ugly. Because he didn't feel like he belonged. Because walking into that room felt like admitting how far he'd fallen from the man he used to be. Because sitting at that table meant facing everything he'd avoided for years. "Your family," Lily said quietly. "This is where you're supposed to be." The words landed softly, but they still hurt. Jim nodded, more to himself than to her. I'm not sure that's true anymore. Through the trees, the house came into view again. The window glowed like a stage, the table fully set now, plates filled, hands moving in practiced motions. And then Jim saw Ethan step into the room. His son leaned down to say something to his wife, smiling in a way Jim hadn't seen directed at him in years. Ethan laughed, shoulders relaxed. Unaware of the silent standoff happening outside, something twisted sharply in Jim's chest. That's him, Lily said, following his gaze. Her voice softened. He doesn't even know you're out here. Jim swallowed. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. Ethan looked whole, grounded, like a man who had learned how to build a life without waiting for his father to catch up. Pride flared and Jim followed immediately by shame. I can't just walk in there, Jim said, his voice low. Not after everything. Lily knelt slightly so they were eye level. He's not a kid anymore, Dad. He can handle a conversation. Jim shook his head. It's not about him handling it. It's about me. He exhaled slowly. I don't know how to start without making it worse. The sounds of dinner drifted out, chairs shifting, glasses clinking, Marie's voice calling everyone to eat. The family began settling in, the moment solidifying without him. Jim felt the separation deepen, like the door was closing inch by inch. Lily stood and crossed her arms, frustration breaking through her calm. Do you know how many times we've tried to reach you? She asked. You always shut us out. You leave before things get uncomfortable. Jim looked down at his hands. I never meant to hurt you. I know, Lily said. But intentions don't change the outcome. Inside, Ethan raised his glass, saying something that made everyone laugh again. Jim's jaw tightened. The warmth inside that house felt almost cruel now, shining so brightly against the cold that wrapped around him. He had never felt so close to his family and so completely outside of it. Please, Lily said, her voice breaking just enough to cut through him. Stop shutting everyone out. Just this once. Jim closed his eyes. Anger stirred not at Lily, not even at Ethan, but at himself. At the years he couldn't get back, at the words he'd never learned to say when they mattered most. Guilt followed close behind, heavy and familiar, and beneath it all, a longing so deep it scared him. I don't know how to fix this, he said finally. Lily straightened, her face tight with disappointment and understanding all at once. Then don't fix it, she said softly. Just don't disappear. She waited a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the house. Jim stayed where he was, watching the light swallow her as she stepped inside. The door closed. The laughter continued, and Jim remained outside, frozen between anger and regret, staring at a family he still wanted, unsure if he was already too late to claim his place among them again. Jim was still standing where Lily had left him when Marie stepped outside. She didn't speak at first. She simply held something in her hands, folded carefully, as if the paper itself carried weight. The porch light caught the edges, yellow against white, and Jim felt a strange tightening in his chest before he even knew what it was. I found this in the drawer, Marie said quietly. It was with some old mail. Jim frowned. What is it? She hesitated, then handed it to him. It's from Ethan. Jim stared at the envelope. There was no stamp, no address, just his name, written in a familiar hand, older, steadier than the last note Ethan had ever left him. His fingers trembled as he opened it, the paper soft from age, creased like it had been unfolded and refolded too many times. He read the first line and felt the ground shift beneath him. The letter wasn't angry the way Jim had expected. It was tired. Ethan wrote about waiting for calls that never came, about wondering if he'd said something unforgivable, or if he'd simply stopped mattering. He wrote about the day he almost showed up unannounced, standing outside Jim's house before turning away, because he didn't want to feel unwanted again. Jim swallowed hard as he read on. Ethan wrote that he had tried more than once. Short messages, half-finished voicemails, small reaches that required courage he hadn't always had. Each time Jim didn't respond, or answered with polite distance, Ethan took it as confirmation. His father didn't care, or worse, he never had. The cold vanished. Jim no longer felt his hands, his feet, the air around him. All he felt was the slow, crushing weight of understanding. He had been waiting for some grand accusation, some dramatic betrayal he could argue with. Instead, he was staring at the quiet damage caused by his silence. He sank onto the bench, the letter shaking in his grip. Memories rearranged themselves in his mind. Missed calls he'd told himself he'd return later. Messages he'd skimmed, unsure how to respond, then never did. Moments he'd convinced himself weren't important enough to address. He saw them now for what they were, not neutrality, not caution, but absence. "You never said you needed me," Jim whispered, reading the words on the page like they might answer him back. Ethan had said it, just not loudly. Marie stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. She didn't try to explain, didn't interrupt. She watched as Jim's face tightened, then crumpled, years of defensiveness collapsing under the truth he could no longer avoid. "This is my fault," Jim said hoarsely. Marie squeezed his shoulder. "It's not all on you," she said gently. "But this part is," Jim replied. His voice broke. "I thought staying quiet was safer. I thought I was giving him space." The letter said otherwise. It spoke of a son who had needed reassurance and received distance instead. A son who had interpreted silence as rejection because no one had taught him another way. Jim folded the letter slowly, reverently, like something fragile. Regret washed through him, deeper than anything he'd felt that day. Not the sharp regret of one argument, but the kind that came from realizing how many chances he'd missed without even noticing. For the first time, Jim didn't try to defend himself. He didn't minimize. He didn't explain. He accepted it. "I hurt him," he said. "Not because I didn't love him, but because I never learned how to show it." Marie nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "You can still try." Jim stared down at the folded letter in his hands. It felt like a bridge unfinished, abandoned halfway through. Slowly, he placed it beside him on the bench, his breathing steadying as a new thought settled in. It wasn't too late. But this time, silence couldn't be his answer. If he wanted to change anything, he would have to be the one to take the first step. Jim sat at the small wooden table near the back porch, the folded letter resting beside his phone like a quiet witness. The house behind him had gone still. Dinner was winding down. Plates were being cleared, voices lowered. For the first time that day, Jim felt the weight of a choice he could no longer postpone. He picked up the phone, then set it down again. His thumb hovered over Ethan's name. It had been there for years, unchanged, like a door he refused to open. Jim tried to picture what he would say once the line connected. The words tangled in his mind, each one feeling either too weak or too late. Apologies sounded hollow and rehearsed. Explanations felt dangerous. Silence, his old refuge, was no longer an option. Marie watched him from the kitchen window, her face a mix of hope and fear. She didn't speak. She knew this moment belonged to him alone. Jim inhaled slowly and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Each tone felt louder than the last, stretching time thin. Jim's chest tightened. He considered hanging up, telling himself he'd try again tomorrow, or next week, or when things felt less raw. Then the ringing stopped. "Hello?" Ethan's voice came through the speaker, older than Jim remembered. Steadier, but unmistakably his son. Jim closed his eyes. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, crowded with years of things left unsaid. It's Dad," Jim finally said. Another pause. Jim imagined Ethan pulling the phone away from his ear, debating whether to end the call. When Ethan spoke again, his tone was guarded. "Yeah, I know." Jim swallowed hard. "I don't know how to start this," he admitted. "But I can't stay quiet anymore." Ethan didn't interrupt. "I read your letter," Jim continued, his voice rough. "The one you never sent. I didn't realize how much I'd hurt you. I thought giving space was the right thing. I see now that it wasn't." His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. "I'm sorry for the years I disappeared, for the calls I didn't return, for making you feel like you didn't matter." His voice cracked. "That was never true." The line stayed open. Jim forced himself not to fill the silence, not to rush in and undo what little honesty he'd managed. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I didn't think you noticed," Ethan said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, just weariness. "After a while, I stopped expecting anything." The words landed hard, but Jim didn't flinch this time. "You didn't deserve that," he said, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I see it now." Ethan exhaled slowly. "I don't know what to do with this, Dad." "I know," Jim replied. "I don't either." I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were. I'm asking for a chance to do better if you're willing." There was a long stretch of quiet. Jim stared at the grain of the table, counting his breaths, bracing himself for rejection. Through the window, he could see Marie clasping her hands together, lips moving in silent prayer. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was careful. "I'm not ready to pretend everything's okay. I wouldn't want you to," Jim said quickly. "I just want to start somewhere." Another pause. Then Ethan said, "Maybe we could talk. In person, just talk." Hope flickered in Jim's chest, fragile but undeniable. "I'd like that," he said. "Whenever you're ready." "Not tonight," Ethan added, "but soon." "That's fair," Jim replied. The call ended without ceremony. No dramatic closure. No promises beyond what either of them could keep. Jim lowered the phone slowly, his hand steady now, his heart pounding. Marie stepped outside, her eyes searching his face. Jim looked up at her and nodded, just once. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. But it was a beginning, and for the first time in years, Jim believed that might be enough to keep going. The cafe sat on a quiet corner, warm light spilling through the windows onto the wet pavement outside. Jim arrived early, choosing a table near the back where he could see the door without being in the center of the room. He wrapped his hands around a mug he hadn't touched, watching steam rise and fade. Every time the bell above the door chimed, his chest tightened. When Ethan finally walked in, Jim recognized him instantly and still felt unprepared. His son looked older than Jim, remembered, broader through the shoulders, his movements measured, confident. Ethan scanned the room, spotted Jim, and paused for just a second before walking over. They stood there awkwardly, unsure whether to shake hands or embrace. In the end, they sat down across from each other, the small table suddenly feeling like a boundary. For a moment, neither spoke. Ethan broke the silence first. "I didn't know what to expect," he said, staring into his coffee. "I almost didn't come." "I'm glad you did," Jim replied softly. Ethan nodded, then finally looked up. The years between them showed in his eyes, not anger, exactly, but something heavier. "I need you to hear this," he said. "Not to defend yourself. Just to hear it." Jim leaned back, folded his hands together, and nodded. "I'm listening." "When you weren't there," Ethan began, "I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need you, but it did matter." His voice stayed steady, but his jaw tightened. "Every school event you missed, every time I needed advice and didn't know who to call, I kept thinking, if I just did better, maybe you'd show up." Jim felt each word land like a quiet blow. He didn't interrupt. "I stopped trying after a while," Ethan continued. "Not because I didn't care, but because it hurt too much to keep hoping." Jim exhaled slowly. "I didn't see it," he said. "I thought staying out of the way was better. I didn't realize how much distance I was creating." His voice wavered. "I failed you. I see that now." Ethan studied him, searching for something. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. "Why was it always silence?" Jim looked down at his hands. "Because I didn't know how to say the right thing, and I was afraid of saying the wrong one." He met Ethan's gaze again. "That fear cost me more than I understood." Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, the tension easing just enough to notice. "I was angry for a long time," he admitted. "I carried it everywhere, but I never stopped loving you." He shook his head. "That was the part I hated the most." The admission hit Jim harder than any accusation. Guilt surged, followed by something lighter relief, fragile but real. "I love you," Jim said quietly. "I always have. I just didn't show it the way you needed." They sat with that truth between them, letting it breathe. "I'm not saying everything's fixed," Ethan said after a moment. "I don't trust easily anymore. That didn't come from nowhere." "I wouldn't expect you to," Jim replied. "Trust is something I'll have to earn." Ethan nodded. "But I don't want to stay stuck either. I'm willing to move forward, slowly." Jim felt his chest tighten again, this time not from fear. "So am I," he said. They talked for another hour, not about the past, but about the present. Work, family, small details that had once felt impossible to share. When they finally stood to leave, the air between them felt different, not healed, but open. Outside the cafe, they hesitated again. This time, Ethan stepped forward, and pulled Jim into a brief, awkward hug. "We'll see how this goes," Ethan said. Jim nodded. "One step at a time." As Ethan walked away, Jim stood there watching, aware that healing had begun, but knowing the hardest part would be proving, day after day, that this time would be different. Jim cleaned the house the morning Ethan was supposed to come over, even though it didn't really need it. He wiped down the counters twice, straightened picture frames that hadn't been touched in years, and lingered over the family photos lined along the hallway. Some still showed Ethan as a teenager, smiling stiffly, already halfway out the door. Jim wondered if his son would notice them or if it would all feel like a museum of a life he'd moved on from. When Ethan's car finally pulled into the driveway, Jim felt the same tightness in his chest he'd felt at the cafe. This was different, though. This wasn't neutral ground. This was the place where things had broken. Ethan stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning the room. "It hasn't changed much," he said. Jim nodded. "I guess I didn't either. Not for a long time." They sat across from each other in the living room, the space between them filled with years of half-finished conversations. Jim had imagined this moment dozens of times since the cafe. But now that it was here, the words came carefully. "I spent a lot of time convincing myself I was doing the right thing," Jim said. "Staying quiet, giving you space." He shook his head. "I see now that I was really just avoiding my own fear." Ethan leaned back, arms crossed. "I thought if you really wanted me around, you would have said something. Anything." His voice wasn't sharp, just honest. "After a while, I stopped waiting." Jim absorbed that, nodding slowly. "I was afraid you'd already made up your mind about me," he admitted. "That if I reached out, you'd shut the door completely." Ethan exhaled. "And I was too proud to knock again." The admission hung between them, fragile but freeing. Jim leaned forward. "I regret that every day," he said. "Not just the silence. The way I never learned how to say what I felt. I thought love was understood. I didn't realize it needed to be shown." Ethan's gaze softened. "I didn't need perfection," he said. "I just needed you." Jim felt the words settle deep. "I'm here now," he said quietly. "I know that doesn't erase anything, but it's the truth." They talked longer than either of them expected. About old misunderstandings that had grown heavier with time. About moments both of them remembered differently. Each truth shared, loosened, something. Not all at once, but enough to let the conversation breathe. At one point, an awkward silence fell. Jim braced himself, expecting retreat. Instead, Ethan looked around the room again and smiled faintly. "I used to think this place held too many bad memories," Ethan said. "Maybe it just holds unfinished ones." Jim felt his throat tighten. "I'd like to finish some of them, if you're willing." Ethan nodded slowly. "I am." The moment that followed wasn't dramatic. No grand apology, no sweeping forgiveness. Just Ethan, standing, extending his hand, then pulling Jim into a brief, stiff hug that softened at the end. "I forgive you," Ethan said. "Not because it doesn't matter, but because I don't want to carry it anymore." Jim closed his eyes, absorbing the weight and relief of the words. "Thank you," he said. They stepped back, both visibly unsure of what came next. But something had shifted. The distance wasn't gone, but it felt crossable now. As Ethan prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "This doesn't fix everything," he said. "I know," Jim replied. "But we can try," Ethan added. Jim watched his son walk down the steps, a quiet determination settling in his chest. Healing would take time, consistency, proof. But for the first time, Jim believed the bridge between them wasn't just repaired, it was open and waiting for them both to keep walking. The days after Ethan's visit felt different. Jim woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, a quiet pull toward doing things he'd avoided for far too long. He began calling when he said he would, answering messages instead of letting them sit, showing up even when it felt awkward. None of it erased the past, but it made the present feel less empty. Ethan noticed. Jim could tell by the way his son responded, still careful, still measured, but no longer distant by default. They spoke on the phone more often now, brief conversations that skirted around deeper subjects. Ethan asked questions. Jim answered honestly. And yet, beneath it all, Jim sensed the hesitation. The trust wasn't rebuilt, it was being tested. One afternoon, Ethan said, "I'm trying, Dad." Not accusing, Just stating a fact. I just don't know how much I'm ready to let go." "I understand," Jim replied. And for the first time, he truly meant it. That evening, Jim sat with Marie at the kitchen table. The same table that had once felt like a border instead of a gathering place. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that invited honesty whether you wanted it or not. "We lost a lot of years," Jim said finally. Marie nodded, fingers wrapped around her mug. "We did." He looked at her then, not as his wife of decades, not as the woman who'd held everything together while he withdrew, but as someone who had endured the silence alongside him. "I know I wasn't there," he said, "for Ethan, for the kids, for you." Marie didn't interrupt. She stared at the tabletop, then met his gaze. "I waited," she said softly, "for you to come back to us. I told myself you just needed time. But after a while, it started to feel like I was alone in the same house." The words cut deep, but Jim didn't flinch. "I didn't know how to talk about what I was feeling," he admitted. "So I didn't talk at all. That was part of the problem," Marie said, not unkindly. Silence filled the spaces where connection should have been. Jim nodded, the truth heavy, but necessary. "I've been so focused on fixing things with Ethan," he said, "that I forgot we need fixing too." Marie's eyes softened. "I was hoping you'd say that." They talked longer than they had in years. About missed moments. About resentment that had settled quietly into their marriage. About the exhaustion of holding hope alone. Tears came, not all at once, but steadily. This wasn't a fight. It was an accounting. "I don't expect everything to change overnight," Marie said. "But I need to know you're here, really here." Jim reached across the table and took her hand. "I am," he said. "And I want to learn how to stay." The moment felt like a hinge, small, almost unremarkable from the outside, but capable of shifting everything that followed. Jim understood then that reconciliation with Ethan was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Healing the family meant facing every relationship he'd neglected, starting with the one that had endured the longest. Later that night, lying awake beside Marie, Jim stared at the ceiling, the weight of the past pressing down on him. Hope was there now, but so was doubt. The damage wasn't confined to one bond. It ran through years, through habits, through people who had learned to live without him. He wondered if he had the strength to rebuild all of it. If showing up now was enough after so much absence. The path ahead felt long, uncertain, and unforgiving. But as sleep finally crept in, one thought stayed with him if he didn't try. The weight of the past would be the only thing he'd ever carry. Jim waited 2 days before making the calls, not because he didn't want to, but because he finally understood that wanting wasn't enough. Reaching out meant accepting whatever came back, even if it hurt, especially if it hurt. He called Carl first. The line went to voicemail. Jim left a short message, his voice steady but careful. "It's Dad. I'd like to talk when you're ready." No excuses, no explanations, just the door left open. Carl returned the call that evening. "What do you want?" Carl asked, not unkindly, but without warmth. Jim didn't flinch. "I want to take responsibility," he said, "for not being there, for missing things that mattered." There was a sharp exhale on the other end. "You missed my graduation," Carl said flatly. "You missed my first promotion. You missed years where I could have used a father." Jim closed his eyes. "I know." Carl's anger surfaced then, not explosive, but controlled, the kind built over time. "You don't get to apologize and expect it to fix anything." "I don't," Jim replied. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to listen." The silence that followed was heavy. "I don't know if I'm there yet," Carl said finally. "I'm still angry." "I understand," Jim said, and this time he truly did. When the call ended, Jim sat quietly, absorbing the weight of it. There was no relief, only the clarity that some wounds would resist being rushed. Lily answered on the second ring. "Dad," she said, surprised. "I was hoping we could talk," Jim said. "If you're willing." They met the next day at a small cafe near her office. Lily smiled when she saw him, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was affection there, but also caution. "I always wanted us to be closer," Lily said once they'd sat down. "I just didn't know how to get there without pushing you away." Jim nodded. "I made it hard," he admitted. "I wasn't present, not the way I should have been." Lily stirred her coffee slowly. "Sometimes I felt like I had to earn your attention," she said. "Like if I didn't need anything, Maybe you'd notice me more." The words cut deeper than Jim expected. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice tight. "You should have never felt that way." They talked for over an hour, about missed conversations, about Lily stepping into the role of peacemaker far too young, about Jim's emotional distance and how it shaped the way she learned to ask for love. "I regret not being there for you," Jim said quietly. "Not showing up. Not asking how you were really doing." Lily looked at him for a long moment. "I forgive you," she said. Then she added, "But I need time." Jim nodded. "Take all the time you need." As they stood to leave, Lily hugged him, brief, careful, but real. "I'm glad you're trying," she said. "Just don't disappear again." "I won't," Jim promised. And he meant it. That night, Jim sat alone in the living room, the house quiet around him. Carl's anger still echoed in his mind. Lily's forgiveness, fragile but hopeful, sat beside it. Two different paths, two different timelines. He realized then that healing wouldn't move at one speed. It would come in uneven steps, setbacks, and moments of doubt. There would be days when progress felt invisible. But for the first time, Jim wasn't measuring success by immediate results. He was measuring it by consistency, by showing up again tomorrow and the day after that. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was finally walking it with his eyes open and no intention of turning back. Jim spent the entire morning preparing for the dinner like it was a test he couldn't afford to fail. The turkey went into the oven early. The table was set carefully, each place measured, each chair pulled out and pushed back in again until it felt right. He told himself not to expect too much. Expectation had ruined enough things already. Carl had said no at first. "I'm not ready to sit around and pretend everything's fine," he'd said over the phone. Marie had stepped in then, her voice steady. "No one's pretending," she'd said. "We're just eating, together. That's all." Carl hadn't agreed, but he hadn't refused again either. Lily confirmed the next day. "I'll come," she said. "Not because it's perfect, because it's something." When the doorbell finally rang that evening, Jim's chest tightened. Lily arrived first, carrying a pie, offering a small smile that held more hope than certainty. They hugged, brief, familiar, cautious. Then Carl walked in. He didn't remove his coat right away. He stood near the doorway, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like he was bracing himself. Jim met his gaze and nodded. No words, just acknowledgement. Dinner began with polite questions and careful answers. Work updates, weather comments, safe territory, silverware scraped against plates, glasses clinked too loudly in the pauses. Jim could feel the tension like static under the table, every unspoken thought vibrating just beneath the surface. He felt like a guest in his own home. Every movement felt watched, every word measured. He reminded himself to stay, to breathe, to let the discomfort exist without retreating. Carl barely ate. Lily tried to keep conversation moving, her voice bright but strained. Marie floated between them, refilling glasses, adjusting dishes, doing what she'd always done, holding things together. Halfway through the meal, silence settled in again, heavy, unavoidable. Jim set his fork down. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "the year the power went out on Thanksgiving?" Lily looked up first. "When we ate by candlelight?" Carl snorted despite himself. "You burned the turkey." Jim smiled faintly. "I didn't burn it. I overcooked it." Lily laughed, a real laugh, surprised, unguarded. Marie smiled too, relief flickering across her face. "We sat in the living room," Jim continued, his voice warming as the memory came back. "Used paper plates. You kids said it was the best Thanksgiving we ever had." Carl leaned back slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to notice. "You told that story about getting stuck in a snowstorm, and you interrupted me every 2 minutes," Jim said, glancing at him. "Correcting the details." Carl shook his head. "Because you exaggerated." For the first time that evening, they laughed together. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long, but it was real. The rest of the dinner didn't magically change. The past was still there. The hurt hadn't vanished. But the air felt lighter, less brittle. They lingered at the table longer than anyone expected, sharing small stories, letting silence exist without fear. As plates were cleared, Jim looked around the table. His family, still fractured, still cautious, but present. "This won't fix everything," he said quietly. Carl nodded. "No, But it's a start, Lily added. Jim held on to that as the evening wound down. The road ahead was long. Trust would take time. Forgiveness would come in layers, not all at once. But as the door closed behind his children and the house settled into quiet again, Jim felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the kind that promises easy endings, but the kind that makes you willing to try again tomorrow. The gathering started small, almost deliberately unremarkable. Coffee on a Sunday afternoon. A shared takeout dinner that ended early. Short visits where no one stayed long enough for old arguments to resurface. Jim understood now that rebuilding trust wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistency, about showing up again and again without demanding anything in return. He worked at being different. When someone asked how he was, he didn't brush it off. He admitted when he felt uncertain, when guilt still lingered, when he didn't have the right words. Saying those things out loud felt awkward, even embarrassing, but Jim pushed through it. For years, his distance had been a shield. Now, it was something he was learning to set down. Ethan began coming more often, not every time, and not without hesitation, but enough that Jim noticed. He listened more than he spoke, watched closely, like he was still deciding whether this version of his father would last. Some days, Ethan laughed easily. Other days, he stayed quiet, arms crossed, the old wariness flickering back when conversations drifted too close to the past. Jim didn't push. He remembered too well what pressure felt like. Marie watched all of it with a quiet kind of relief. She didn't say much, but Jim saw it in the way her shoulders finally relaxed, and how she lingered in rooms filled with voices instead of retreating to the kitchen. Still, she was careful. Years of disappointment had taught her that progress didn't mean permanence. "This takes time," she reminded Jim one evening after everyone had left. "I know," he said, and this time he truly did. Lily became the bridge without announcing herself as one. She sat beside Carl during dinners, nudging conversations away from dead ends, reminding him of shared memories that hadn't yet been poisoned by resentment. When Carl scoffed or withdrew, she didn't scold him, she waited him out. "He's trying," she said to Carl quietly one night. "I can see it." Carl didn't respond right away, but he didn't argue either. Jim noticed the small things. Carl staying a few minutes longer than planned, asking neutral questions instead of sharp ones. Not forgiving, but not rejecting either. It felt fragile, like something that could collapse under the wrong weight. Late at night, after the house had gone quiet, Jim lay awake with doubt pressing in. He replayed every conversation, every hesitation, wondering if his efforts were enough or if they were simply too late. Fear still whispered that one mistake could undo everything. But something had changed. Instead of retreating when that fear surfaced, Jim leaned into it. He reminded himself that discomfort was part of growth. That rebuilding didn't mean erasing the past, it meant carrying it differently. One afternoon, as they sat around the table eating soup Lily had brought over, Ethan asked Jim a simple question. "Do you ever think about those years?" he asked. "About what you'd do differently?" Jim paused. "Every day," he said honestly. "But I can't change them. I can only be here now." Ethan nodded, absorbing the answer. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't dismissal either. As the weeks passed, something subtle settled over the family. Not peace yet, but possibility. Conversations flowed a little more easily. Silences felt less threatening. Laughter came without surprise. Jim felt it most clearly in the quiet moments, when he watched his children interact without tension pulling them apart. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel reckless. It felt earned. New beginnings didn't arrive with certainty or celebration. They arrived quietly, in small, repeated choices. And Jim held on to that feeling, knowing the road ahead was still long but believing, finally, that it was worth walking. The family meeting wasn't planned as a confrontation. It started the way the others had coffee on the table, chairs pulled close, everyone pretending this was just another quiet afternoon together. But Jim felt it the moment Carl sat down. His son didn't lean back or look at his phone. He stayed upright, hands clasped tightly, jaws set like he'd already made a decision. "I need to say something," Carl said. The room stilled. Lily looked up first. Marie froze halfway through, setting down a cup. Jim nodded once, bracing himself. Carl didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The restraint made it heavier. "I've been carrying this for years," he said, eyes locked on Jim. "And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter." Jim folded his hands together and listened. "You weren't there," Carl continued. "Not when I needed advice. Not when things fell apart. I learned how to handle everything on my own because I didn't have a choice." His breath hitched slightly, anger pushing through the control. "I watched other people have fathers who showed up, and I kept wondering what I'd done wrong." Jim felt the words land in his chest, each one finding its mark. He didn't interrupt, didn't defend. He stayed still. "I told myself it didn't bother me," Carl said. "That I didn't need you. But that was a lie. It hurt. It still does." Silence filled the room. Lily's eyes shimmered, but she stayed quiet. Marie's hand covered her mouth. Jim finally spoke. His voice was low, steady. "You didn't do anything wrong." Carl scoffed softly. "Then why weren't you there?" Jim swallowed. "Because I failed you," he said. "I didn't know how to be present when things got hard, and instead of learning, I pulled away." He looked directly at Carl. "I'm sorry for every moment you felt alone because of me." Carl's composure cracked. His shoulders tensed, his breathing uneven. "You don't get to say sorry and erase it," he said, voice breaking. "Those years shaped me." "I know," Jim replied. "And I'm not asking you to forget them. I'm asking you to let me acknowledge them." Carl stood abruptly, turning away, pacing the room like he needed movement to keep himself together. When he turned back, his eyes were red. "I don't trust easily anymore," he said, "because the one person I thought would always be there wasn't." Jim nodded. "You have every right to feel that way." The admission seemed to deflate Carl. He sat back down heavily, rubbing his hands over his face. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I hear your apology," he said, "and part of me wants to accept it." He looked up. "But I need time." Relief and grief collided inside Jim. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here." Lily finally spoke. "This doesn't end here," she said gently. "This is just the first step." Carl glanced at her, then back at Jim. "I'm not saying everything's okay," he said, "but I'm willing to keep talking." That was enough. Jim felt emotionally hollowed out, drained in a way that felt almost cleansing. Carl had spoken his truth fully, painfully, and Jim had stayed. He hadn't retreated. He hadn't minimized. For the first time, they had met each other honestly. As the meeting ended and everyone began to drift apart, Jim remained seated, breathing slowly. The path ahead was still uncertain. Trust wouldn't return overnight. It might not return easily at all. But this moment, raw, uncomfortable, and necessary, had opened a door Jim had spent years pretending wasn't there, and now he would have to prove he was willing to walk through it. Jim and Ethan sat on opposite ends of the back porch, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the wooden boards. There was no agenda this time, no careful setup, just two men sharing space that had once felt off limits. "I didn't tell you everything before," Ethan said, breaking the quiet. His voice was calm, but his fingers worried the edge of his sleeve. "About how it really felt." Jim turned slightly toward him. "You can," he said. "I'm here." Ethan stared out at the yard. "It hurt more than I let on," he admitted. "I learned how to be independent because I had to. But there were moments I didn't want to be." He paused. "I felt like I was raising myself." The words settled heavily between them. Jim nodded slowly. "I see that now," he said. "And I hate that I didn't see it then." He took a breath. "I should have stayed connected, even when I didn't know what to say. I should have tried harder." Ethan glanced at him, searching his face. Something shifted, subtle, cautious. "I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty," he said. "I just don't want to pretend it didn't shape who I am." "I wouldn't ask you to," Jim replied. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of honesty resting without pressure. Ethan's posture eased just a little. The edge in his voice softened. "I'm not ready to trust everything yet," Ethan said. "I've been disappointed before." "I know," Jim said, "and I won't rush you." Instead of words, Jim showed up. He helped Ethan fix a broken fence one weekend, drove across town when Ethan needed an extra set of hands, answered calls, even the small ones. And when Ethan talked, Jim listened without trying to fix or explain. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once. It came in glances that lingered a second longer, in shared laughter that surprised them both, in moments where Ethan spoke freely, then caught himself, waiting to see if Jim would disappear again. Jim didn't. "I'm trying," Jim said one evening, handing Ethan a cup of coffee. "I know that doesn't erase anything." Ethan nodded. "I see it." That acknowledgement felt like progress. Jim understood now that rebuilding wasn't dramatic. It was slow, repetitive, and sometimes uncomfortable. It required humility instead of pride, patience instead of urgency. Every day was a chance to either reinforce trust or lose ground. Their conversations deepened gradually. Ethan spoke more about his struggles, his doubts, the pressure he'd carried alone. Jim didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss. He stayed. And in staying, something fragile but real began to take shape. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan leaned back, exhaling. "I don't know where this ends," he said. Jim looked at him steady. "Neither do I." But for the first time, neither of them felt like walking away. The growth was slow, uneven, still vulnerable to old fears. Yet as they sat there together, Jim sensed that something essential had begun to mend, and whether it would hold depended on what he did next, not just today, but every day after. Change didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, in the shape of promises kept. Jim showed up when he said he would. He called back. He listened without rushing to explain. When tension surfaced, he didn't retreat. He stayed in the room, even when it felt uncomfortable, even when the old instinct to disappear tugged at him. Ethan noticed first. He stopped hovering near the door at family gatherings, stopped checking his watch like he was counting minutes. He stayed through the awkward pauses, through the conversations that brushed against old wounds. It wasn't easy, but instead of withdrawing, he leaned in, choosing effort over avoidance. Marie watched it all, with a cautious kind of gratitude. She saw it in the way Jim asked how her day had been, and waited for the answer. In the way he noticed when she was tired, when she needed quiet, when she needed reassurance. These were small things, but they had been missing for a long time. Lily saw it too. "You're different," she said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "Not perfect, just here." Jim smiled faintly. "I'm trying to be." Carl remained the most guarded. He didn't soften all at once. Some days, his tone was clipped, his patience thin, but he no longer avoided Jim outright. He spoke when spoken to. He stayed longer than planned. He engaged on his own terms, cautiously, testing the ground beneath his feet. Jim didn't push him. He remembered how fragile trust was, how easily pressure could fracture it. One night, after everyone had gone home, Jim and Marie sat together in the living room, the lights low, the house quiet in a way that felt peaceful instead of empty. "I didn't think we'd get here," Marie said softly. "Neither did I," Jim admitted. They talked about the years they'd lost without blame this time, about the damage silence had done, about the weight Marie had carried while Jim pulled away. Jim thanked her for staying, for believing there was still something worth saving even when he hadn't given her much reason to. "I'm grateful you didn't give up," he said. Marie reached for his hand. "I'm grateful you came back." The moment felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to as they moved forward. They both knew the family would never return to what it once was. Too much had changed. Too much had been said and unsaid, but maybe that wasn't the goal anymore. Later that night, Jim sat alone, thinking about the path behind him, the isolation, the regret, the long years where he'd convinced himself distance was easier than vulnerability. He had come far, but he wasn't finished. There were still moments when doubt crept in, still days when old habits whispered that it would be safer to pull away. But Jim recognized those instincts now. He didn't obey them. The family they were becoming wasn't built on nostalgia. It was built on honesty, on effort, on the willingness to stay when staying was hard. It wasn't the family Jim remembered, but it was real. And for the first time, he didn't fear that truth. As he turned off the lights and headed to bed, Jim knew one thing for certain. The change he'd made wasn't fragile anymore. It had roots. But whether it would hold would depend on what he did tomorrow and every day after that. Thanksgiving arrived again without announcement. Quiet and steady, like a test no one said out loud they were taking. This time, there were no negotiations about who would come, no carefully worded invitations. The family simply agreed, not because everything was fixed, but because avoiding each other no longer felt like the answer. Before dinner, Jim and Ethan stood together on the back porch, the same place where so many difficult conversations had begun. The air was cold, but familiar, comfortable. "It's strange," Ethan said, looking out into the yard. "A year ago, I wasn't sure we'd ever do this again." Jim nodded. I wasn't sure either. They stood in silence for a moment, neither rushing to fill it. "You've changed," Ethan said finally. "I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was temporary." Jim accepted that without defense. "I know," he said. "I spent a long time being someone you couldn't rely on." Ethan looked at him then. "I'm still careful," he admitted. "But I see the effort. That matters." "It matters to me too," Jim replied. More than I knew how to say before. Inside, Lily and Carl arrived almost together. There was no stiffness in their movements, no bracing for impact. Carl set down a bottle of wine without comment. Lily hugged Marie, lingering just long enough to feel real. Marie moved through the kitchen with ease, her movements lighter than Jim remembered. Hosting didn't feel like an obligation anymore. It felt like hope. She smiled as she brought the food to the table, watching her family settle in without hesitation. Dinner wasn't loud. There were no booming stories or forced laughter. Instead, conversation flowed gently. Shared observations, simple updates, comfortable pauses. No one felt the need to perform. Jim looked around the table and felt something unfamiliar and grounding. Presence. The tension that once sat heavy between them had softened into something manageable. Not erased, but acknowledged. Carl met Jim's eyes across the table and gave a small nod. Not forgiveness, but acceptance of the moment. As the meal continued, Jim let himself reflect. The long walk in the cold, the letter, the phone call he'd almost hung up on, every painful step that had led them here. None of it had been easy. All of it had been necessary. "I'm glad we did this," Lily said quietly. "So am I," Maria replied. Jim didn't speak. He didn't need to. He felt it in the weight of the moment, the quiet gratitude, the shared understanding that what they had now was earned, not assumed. When dessert was served, the mood stayed calm. No one rushed to leave. No one lingered out of obligation. They stayed because they wanted to. As the evening wound down, Jim stood at the sink, rinsing plates, listening to his family move through the house. The sound didn't feel distant anymore. This dinner wasn't perfect. There were still wounds that would take time to fully heal, but it was honest, and honesty had replaced avoidance. As the night settled in, Jim knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was a beginning, quiet, genuine, and hard-won. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The weeks after Thanksgiving unfolded without urgency, as if the family had collectively decided to stop racing toward an outcome and focus instead on the work in front of them. Jim and Ethan spoke often now, not just about the past, but about ordinary things. Work frustrations, small victories, the kinds of conversations that had once felt impossible. When old wounds surfaced, they didn't turn away from them. They slowed down, asked questions, and listened. "I'm still figuring things out," Ethan admitted one afternoon as they walked through the park. "About us." "I am too," Jim said. "But I'm not going anywhere." That promise mattered not because it sounded good, but because Jim backed it up. He showed up, again and again. At home, Jim and Marie talked late into the evenings, sitting side by side with no distractions between them. They spoke about the years ahead, not in broad plans, but in shared intentions. To keep choosing honesty, to address distance before it hardened, to protect what they were rebuilding. "We're not the same people we were," Marie said one night. Jim nodded. "But we're better at listening now." Carl began to soften in quieter ways. He joined family gatherings more regularly, staying longer each time. He didn't forget the past, but he didn't let it dominate every moment either. When Jim offered help, Carl didn't immediately refuse. He accepted it cautiously, on his own terms. That was enough for now. Lily and Ethan surprised them all. They started spending time together outside of family obligations, coffee, shared errands, unplanned conversations. They discovered similar frustrations, similar humor. Years of distance gave way to something lighter. "We should have done this sooner," Lily said once. "Maybe," Ethan replied. "But we're doing it now." Jim watched these connections form with a mix of gratitude and humility. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like an observer. He felt involved, present, needed not because of obligation, but because he'd earned his place. He also knew nothing was guaranteed. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and unpromising in its details. There would be disagreements, setbacks, Old fears that resurfaced when no one expected them. But now, they had something they hadn't had before: communication. Empathy. A shared willingness to try again. One evening, Jim sat alone in the living room, the house quiet, but not lonely. He thought about the man. He'd been the one who'd stood outside in the cold, watching through a window. That man felt distant now, like someone he'd known but no longer recognized. The man he was becoming wasn't perfect, but he was present. When Ethan called later that night, just to check in, Jim answered without hesitation. "I was thinking," Ethan said, "about taking a trip together. Nothing big, just time." Jim smiled to himself. "I'd like that." After the call ended, Jim sat back, letting the moment settle. The future wasn't something to fear anymore. It wasn't something to control. It was something to walk into, step by step, conversation by conversation together. Jim didn't wake up one morning free of regret. It loosened its grip slowly, in quiet moments when he wasn't looking for it. Standing at the sink, watching sunlight spill across the counter. Sitting in the living room, listening to voices fill the house without tension attached to them. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped defining every step forward. He began to forgive himself in pieces. For the years he didn't know how to show love. For the silence he thought was protection. For the man he had been when fear felt safer than vulnerability. He stopped replaying every mistake like a punishment and started seeing them for what they were: lessons learned too late, but not too late to matter. Ethan changed too. Not dramatically, but with intention. He took on more responsibility during gatherings, stepping in without being asked, helping Marie, checking on Carl, making sure things ran smoothly. He wasn't trying to impress Jim, he was claiming his place in the family. Jim watched with quiet pride, recognizing the son he'd always believed was there. "You don't have to do everything," Jim said once. Ethan smiled. "I know. I want to." Those words stayed with Jim. In the evenings, Jim and Marie shared small, unremarkable moments that felt profound in their simplicity. Walks after dinner, quiet cups of tea, conversations that didn't circle old wounds but acknowledged them without fear. "We're different now," Marie said one night as they sat together on the porch. Jim nodded. "And that's okay." Carl showed up more fully too. He spoke when he saw someone struggling. He offered help without hesitation. His anger hadn't vanished, but it no longer controlled him. There was space now for something else: respect, caution, possibility. Lily and Ethan grew closer in ways that surprised them both. They shared stories they'd never told each other, discovered shared memories filtered through different perspectives. And through that bond, they both moved closer to Jim, not because they felt obligated, but because they wanted to. Jim noticed it in the way conversations lingered, in the way laughter came easily, in the way no one felt the need to leave early anymore. One afternoon, as the family gathered in the backyard, Jim stood back and watched. Ethan grilling, Carl setting up chairs, Lily laughing with Marie. The scene wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. He felt something release inside him, an old weight finally set down. The family he once hoped for hadn't returned in the way he imagined, but something better had taken its place, something earned. Later, as the sun dipped low, Jim and Marie walked hand in hand down the quiet street. No rush, no destination. "We've come a long way," Marie said softly. Jim squeezed her hand. "And we're still going." The path ahead remained uncertain. Healing always was. But for the first time, Jim wasn't carrying regret like a burden. He was carrying it like a reminder of how far they'd come and how much still waited ahead. Jim and Ethan sat together in the living room long after everyone else had gone to bed. The house wrapped in a quiet that felt earned. The lights were low, the world outside distant. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like space. "I don't think the past gets to decide everything anymore," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "Not if we don't let it." Jim nodded slowly. "It shaped us," he said, "but it doesn't have to own us." They talked about the future without fear, not in grand plans or promises, but in intentions. Showing up, staying connected, saying the hard things before they turned into distance. Jim felt the weight of those words settle in his chest, not as pressure, but as purpose. "I want us to keep this," Ethan said, "whatever this is." "We will," Jim replied. "I won't disappear again." Earlier that evening, Marie had pulled Jim aside in the kitchen, her voice low and sincere. "I see you," she said. "Not just trying, but changing." Jim swallowed. I wish I'd done it sooner. So do I, Marie said gently. But I'm grateful you did it at all. Those words stayed with him. Later, Carl joined Jim on the porch. The night air cool and steady. They stood side by side without speaking for a while. You handled things differently, Carl said finally. You listened. Jim nodded. I learned the hard way. Carl glanced at him. I'm not forgetting the past, he said. But I can see the effort now. That means more than you know, Jim replied. Inside, Lily sat with a cup of tea, watching her father move through the house with ease instead of hesitation. When she spoke, her voice held quiet appreciation. It feels different now, she said. Not perfect, but real. Jim smiled at that. As the night wound down, Jim felt something settle into place. Peace not because everything was finished, but because everything was moving forward. Before Ethan left, they stood near the door, reluctant to end the moment. Let's not wait for holidays, Ethan said. We'll make time, regularly. Jim nodded. I'd like that. After the door closed, Jim stood alone for a moment, then turned off the lights. The house no longer felt like a place filled with echoes. It felt alive. He smiled, not because the journey had been easy, but because it had been worth it. And as he headed upstairs, Jim knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something better. Jim and Ethan walked side by side down the quiet path that wound through the neighborhood park, their footsteps steady, unhurried. The trees were bare, branches reaching into the gray sky. But there was warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. Not from the weather, but from the space between them. We've been through a lot, Ethan said, hands tucked into his jacket. More than I ever thought we'd come back from. Jim nodded. I didn't always think we would. They walked in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. Jim thought about the long road behind them, the cold night outside the house, the letter that changed everything, the phone call that could have ended before it began. Every step had been painful in its own way. Necessary. Forgiveness isn't easy, Jim said finally. But it's the only way to heal. For both of us. Ethan stopped walking. He looked at his father, really looked at him, as if measuring the weight of those words. I used to think forgiveness meant letting you off the hook, he said, like pretending it didn't matter. Jim shook his head. It mattered. Ethan nodded slowly. I see that now. They resumed walking. The path curved gently ahead, disappearing into trees. Ethan's posture had changed over the past year, less guarded, more grounded. He spoke with confidence now, not bravado. I'm proud of where I'm going, Ethan said, of what I've built. Jim felt his chest tighten, not with regret this time, but pride. You should be, he said. You did it on your own, and I'm honored to walk beside you now. At home, the family moved forward together in quiet ways. Shared meals, simple conversations, moments that didn't need to be marked as progress to matter. Peace didn't mean perfection, it meant presence. Ethan stepped into the future with clarity, taking responsibility for his own life while staying connected to the family he'd once kept at arm's length. Jim watched from a distance, no longer afraid of being left behind. For the first time, letting go didn't feel like loss. As the sun dipped lower, Jim and Ethan slowed their pace. They didn't need to rush. They had time now. I'm glad we didn't give up, Ethan said. So am I, Jim replied. They reached the end of the path and turned back toward home, walking together. No words were needed. Jim knew then that forgiveness wasn't just something you gave, it was something you lived, a choice made daily. And as they walked forward, side by side, Jim understood the legacy he would leave behind wasn't defined by his mistakes, but by the courage it took to face them and the love it took to make things right.